Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm David Brandon, today with Anders Strindberg. Thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
I'd like to talk about your new book, Islamism. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, when my co-author Mats Van and I started working on this manuscript, we had a particular issue in mind. We were focused on trying to figure out the relationship and the apparent contradiction between the global manifestation of Islamism, Islamism as a global trend, and the local manifestations of Islamism, which are diverse and in many cases divergent in terms of strategic objectives and tactics and political alignments and so on and so forth. So we were trying to figure out, what is the relationship between this global level trend and these local manifestations.
Yeah, and you're going beyond just the Sunni-Shia divides when you talk about the difference between the local and the global. Is that right? You're getting beyond just the sectarian divides.
We're looking at societal differences, cultural differences, political alignment differences. There are a number of ways that this Islamist movement is sliced and diced.
Right. But it really does seem to be either one or the other. They never do seem to merge them in the literature.
No, they don't. And I think this is a problem of a lot of the literature on religious political movements out there, social science literature, that there is no, in large parts of it, there is no adequate way to account for the real-world political impact of religious faith. There's either this tendency to reduce religious action or religiously based action to kind of cynical manipulation on the one hand of people who prey on the innocents, as it were.
Yes.
Or on the other hand, to portray everyone as a religious fanatic who has this otherworldly focus.
Yeah, this idea of religious faith, which it seems odd that it's not dealt with in the literature, but you're right. It's much more political or geography based rather than. I mean, it seems obvious that you have to deal with that, but
this is in part due to, I would say, the inadequacy of a lot of the analytical frameworks within social sciences for dealing with the real-world political impact of real and sincerely held faith convictions.
Belief structures that are being dealt with in frameworks that had more to do with Cold War era paradigms than faith issues. This is good. So you needed to go to a sociologically based analytical framework, or you're going to miss the nuance that's so rich.
Absolutely. And there is this tendency in the literature to either portray religious agents or people who act on their religious faith either as cynical manipulators who are really out for material gain,
right,
or on the other hand as sort of world-averse, otherworldly focused lunatics, right?
Right. So on the one hand, they're reduced to this rational actor model that deals more with states. And on the other hand, it's almost like a psychological view of them as imbalanced or not fully modern.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And neither of them is able to take into account how these actors themselves understand their actions. And this is what we're trying to get at. There's a lot of talk about how we need to think like a terrorist and how we need to understand the mind of the Arab and all these various things. And they all tend to back off at some point and make it all about the social scientific researcher's point of view and miss out on lots of the insight that you get from trying to really delve into the internal understanding of the conflict, which you can only do based on primary sources.
Right.
You can only do it based on a sort of sincere conviction that how these groups and individuals understand their own actions is important for us to be able to deal with the outcomes of those actions.
Well, that brings up a couple of things. It's interesting that you're wanting to get back to source material, and I know that you've spent quite a bit of time talking to the actual groups. And I understand Mats has done similar with some of his case studies, which is a unique perspective in itself, rather than being written from afar to go actually engage with research subjects, and rather than seeing them only as objects. So that is, to me, analytically, it's a very unique perspective in your approach. But a second kind of surprise to me was finding Frantz Fanon's post-colonial kind of analysis in there.
We make use of Frantz Fanon because he was someone who constructed a framework for understanding the psychology, the socially constructed worldview of individuals engaged in, well, in his case, he was working within himself. He was working within the Algerian conflict with the French.
No, definitely.
So he constructed this framework for understanding, in his language, the native as the native understands himself.
So it's almost like he's letting the people actually involved in the process have an explanatory voice. But there will be some who will say, well, then you become a spokesman for the despised, do you not?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, there are people who would say that, and I would say, well, if you don't try to understand these conflicts from the perspective of the people who are involved in them, you're not going to understand how to address them. You're not going to understand what it is that drives people, and what motivates people, and what objectives they work for. If you only have this outside perspective, if you insist that the outside researcher's point of view is all that is needed, then you're not going to get at what actually drives people on the ground. And that's problematic, because in order to develop actual practical models for addressing some of these conflicts, we do need to know how people understand their own situations.
You want to come up with a framework for actually doing something between social groups, and so it can't. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It can't just be the researcher's view if you're going to have a nuanced understanding in how to deal with that.
And another thing I would say is that understanding does not mean justifying, right?
Oh, yeah,
Understanding,
an important distinction.
Understanding is not a synonym of endorsement.
Yeah, exactly.
So to understand something, I mean, this is what academics are meant to do, to understand issues, to understand social phenomena, and then interpret them and explain them to an audience.
But here's a problem. You bring up something interesting in that understanding it is not the same as endorsing it. Yet it would seem that some within the academy seek to own the language. They want to own the narrative. And if you use similar words, then you're painted with a brush as if you're endorsing it. But I think that's a really good point. The idea here is not to say, I understand it, therefore you make some moral choice about it. You're saying, I understand it, therefore I have a greater ability to effectively interact with that group, whatever it may be along the range of continuum from let's sit down and talk to take some military action.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I mean that's the point of the ground level analysis, and that's the point of a nuanced understanding of these conflicts.
Yeah, without understanding that perspective, that whole perspective, I guess you're going to miss opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I see.
And so for some readers, it's going to be about looking at this and say, okay, how can we better manage our resources, right? Resource management is a big deal. And
current environment, I would say yes.
And in order to know which groups are an immediate threat, which groups are not an immediate threat, we really do need to have this level of analysis. The macro level broad common denominators are not helpful.
So we have to get beyond this all or very local, understand how the local relates to the global, and that gives us seams for action in the future. You're not doing this just for knowledge. I like your resource allocation kind of highlight. There are limited resources. We need to be able to respond to potentially dangerous groups. Let's understand the whole range of possibilities. That's quite a unique approach, trying to merge these in-group, out-group relationships.
Well, an example of understanding the difference between the local and the global level can be found within Al-Qaeda. The language we use, mostly as kind of throwaway phrases, is we talk about the Al-Qaeda franchise. We talk about Al-Qaeda as if there was a central hub pushing out a centrally produced product through local outlets. That's what a franchise does. And that, a franchise concept has been never adequately explained in the literature, but it's constantly used as a sort of...
Same product sold in different locations in the same manner, essentially.
And we're arguing that what goes on is within the Al-Qaeda sphere is more to be better understood as branding, where a local organization has a local product and then buys into a brand. The difference becomes apparent when you take out the center, right? Because in a franchise, if the center goes, the structure has no product, right? But with branding, the product is still there. It's locally produced, and it's marketed with this brand name. When that brand name no longer has any utility, you withdraw from it. You choose another one.
So it can be jettisoned for something else.
So an example of this would be, for instance, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which bought into and then bought out of the Al-Qaeda brand when it was suitable and when it was no longer suitable. And there's for many of these groups, what matters is the local conflict that they're involved in. Before they join Al-Qaeda and after they join Al-Qaeda. What they get through buying into the brand by pledging allegiance to the Al-Qaeda leadership is name recognition, access to resources, access to intel sharing, and so on. But in a surprising number of cases, the conflicts that they are involved in remains that local conflict. And then they have this network where they share other resources. But for instance, for the Algerians, for the Libyans, for the Somalis even.
So Al-Shabaab then becomes branded with Al-Qaeda, yet still concerned about local Somali issues.
Yeah, they brand themselves because they buy into the brand,
okay,
right?
I see.
And then they become someone because Al-Qaeda has name power.
They didn't franchise Al-Qaeda Central and come to Somalia with it. I do understand. Yes, it's quite a distinction. Actually.
And when we're talking about the viability of the organization, when we're talking about what is the impact of, say, the death of the killing of bin Laden here in earlier this year, then the difference is huge if we understand it as a franchise or as a branding process. Because in a franchise, this is going to be a real problem that reverberates throughout the organization. If we're talking about branding, then the local products can be remains the same.
I hadn't thought of that difference between the branding and the franchise before, but I look forward to thinking about it more with you. And thank you very much for coming to Viewpoints.
Thank you.